January 1986. The question arrived in conversation like an everyday object set on a kitchen counter, so ordinary it might have been swept aside, and yet heavy enough to change the texture of the morning. Someone asked me whether I had forgiven my parents. The date matters. The mid-1980s had their own vocabulary for private life. This was the year when the language of self-help and personal responsibility sat easily alongside a cultural insistence that adults tidy their inner lives. Forgiveness in that idiom often reads like a single act, a tidy catharsis staged for an audience as much as for oneself. My experience of the word had been formed against a quieter ledger, the private reckonings of families where grudges accrued not as dramatic ruptures but as a slow build-up of small austerities. That question made a sound as it landed, then moved on. Even then I had learned that forgiveness in the household resisted theatricality. It was not a tidy curtain call, not the kind of resolution a sermon or a television special could sell. Instead I had learned to think of forgiveness as a set of practices, a daily grammar composed of modest decisions, written in pencil and ink, a sequence of small acts chosen to preserve dignity rather than to create drama. In that household, comportment could be wiser than confession. To do the work that produces a better life without demanding a certified absolution. This, I believed, was sometimes the only honest choice. October 2009. The first clear hinge of the second act came in October 2009. The timing was more than personal. The wider world had been shaken by the financial crisis of 2008. Its tremors reoriented how families thought about risk and thrift. The new decade arrived with a heightened sensibility for contingency. In that particular autumn I had a cardiac episode that interrupted a pattern of pretending at invulnerability. It was not cinematic, no collapsing on a stairwell, no dramatic CPR scene. It was a clinical morning, a brief ambulance ride that smelled of disinfectant and coffee, and an admitting room lit by fluorescent hum and soft beeps. The scar of that afternoon was practical as much as emotional. It taught me the arithmetic of vulnerability in a way that abstract fears never had. The episode forced a reorientation toward contingency. I began to think with a new and urgent interest about powers of attorney, proxies, and the small legal instruments that convert wishes into action when memory or voice fail. My son and I sat down and wrote things we had not written before, preferences for care, names of people authorized to act in our stead, short notes about values for the moments when values matter more than memory. The act of writing those directives, the feel of paper, the pressure of the pen against knuckle, the way my son paused before suggesting a phrase, was itself a moral rehearsal. It converted vague, looming anxieties into a plan small enough to follow and thereby less overwhelming to live with. Winter 2009 to 2010, the winter that followed was an economic and domestic test, one of those seasons that can break brittle household scaffolding built on thrift. The city seemed to sit under a longer cold that season. Storms lingered, gutters iced, and heating bills rose. For people raised in households that equated thrift with virtue and survival, such winters expose fragile architecture. My parents, who had learned discipline as the only sure way to keep things from unraveling, found themselves short in ways I had long suspected but that had been manageable behind closed doors. A surprise heating bill arrived with a stern notice. Past due property tax statements, previously postponed with resourceful phone calls, began to pile into a weight that made casual shrugging impossible. A medical copay, once laughed off in conversation, returned as a mailed demand that made indifference feel immoral. These were not the sort of dramatic reckonings that make front-page headlines. They were instead a chain of small, precise emergencies that, when added, became urgent. In a political moment when public rhetoric insisted on self-reliance and safety nets felt threadbare, the practical needs of older adults often slipped between public services and private shame. For two people steeped in the belief that scarcity proved character, asking for help could feel like an admission of moral failure. The system itself seemed designed to reward those who could complete forms and demand explanations, and to punish those whose pride delayed action until necessity overwhelmed them. February 2010. Around then I began to pay their bills. The sentence sounds blunt because it understates the tender algebra it required. It is important to be plain about what this was and what it was not. It was not a dramatic takeover staged under electric lights. It was not an act of moral denunciation offered at a family meeting. I did not announce a new hierarchy. I avoided spectacle. Instead, I offered quietly and methodically what I knew how to offer: attention, time, an inclination toward order. I treated their finances the way I treated the rental property I managed, with schedules, with autopay where it made sense, with calls to the right offices in the right order. Paying bills was less about paternalism than about translating a moral impulse into administrative practice. I negotiated an installment plan for their taxes so the house would not tumble into the cascade of liens and auctions that can empty a life's meaning on paper. I declined performative thanks, the kind that masks embarrassment. When my mother muttered, I took care of it, and let silence do the work until the instruments of daily life bore out what had actually happened. I recorded each transaction in the spreadsheet I kept for things that mattered: date, check number, purpose. I insisted on a column labeled dignity. That column could not be converted into dollars easily, but I kept it because accounting had become both technical and ethical. Each entry was a small moral claim, a refusal to let poverty be a spectacle and an insistence that practical help could be given without humiliation. Spring 2010. Paying the bills reopened old wounds as surely as it solved new ones. Each cleared check carried a memory. When I covered a piano lesson for my son, my mother's raised eyebrow at the invoice for guitar lessons echoed in my head. When I paid a clinic bill, my father's terse note about pampering returned like a cold draft, his word for anything he judged indulgent. The expenditures were a mixture of reparation and quiet rebellion, practical outlays, yes, but also a refusal to accept the cyclic calculus of shame that had been a family instinct for decades. Sometimes the payments were for essentials: insulin, a primary care visit, a plumber to clear a frozen pipe. Sometimes they were for small comforts: a winter coat my father would complain about but wear, slippers my mother insisted were unnecessary until her toes betrayed her. These purchases were not trophies or attempts to enact power. They were minute, careful interventions intended to keep bodies warm and pride intact. In a culture that often reduces care to drama, hospital scenes and last apologies, the real work of care is more prosaic, ensuring continuity of life. Each check, each pharmacy run, each polite negotiation with a utility company was a stitch in a broader fabric meant to preserve everyday dignity. August 2011. The question of who held authority surfaced in a call my sister made from another state. Families spread across distance develop an anxious cadence when money and authority are involved. Calls that are at once practical and tentative, questions that seek both facts and an implicit authorization. My sister asked whether I had taken over things. Her voice was cautious. She was aware, rightly, that money is also a language of power and that within families that language too easily translates into legal claims. I reassured her that I had no interest in consolidating authority. Autopays could be halted, mail redirected, checks written and then explained. We clarified roles: who would be the official proxy on paper, who would handle day-to-day calls, how the two of us would coordinate. I did not want to be a steward of shame or an executor of revenge. My aim was to prevent the cascade of small humiliations that can, when accumulated, turn a life into a ledger of disgrace. We agreed upon transparency: copies of bank statements, scanned receipts, a shared folder of documents. That small administrative clarity kept suspicion out of our relationship and allowed us to act without making charity itself into an accusation. November 2012, another medical pivot arrived. My mother developed a tremor in her hands. At a neurology appointment, the doctor used the word progression in tones that compressed some futures into inevitability. For families of a certain era, the clinical language of neurological decline carries a cultural script: withdrawal from public life, increasing dependency, and the attendant loss of autonomy. The diagnosis altered the landscape of decisions. The documents we had written after my cardiac event proved suddenly necessary. We had named a proxy, someone outside the tight circle, an impartial figure whose role could protect against the sudden contests that often erupt when medical choices force family members into contention. Naming a proxy did not soften personal frictions. It did, however, make processes legible. An impartial proxy reduces the bitterness that confusion over intention often produces. There is a certain civic intelligence in laying out roles before a crisis forces them into being. Those months in late 2012 felt less like a replay of old domestic grievances and more like the opening of a new chapter, one where the law and the family intersected awkwardly but usefully. December 2012 to 2013. My son, who had been raised at our kitchen table amid receipts and disputes about how best to fix a leaky sink, sat with me through appointments. He was young enough to ask naive questions and old enough to translate medical jargon into verbs. In clinic rooms that smelled of antiseptic and nervous breath, he asked doctors to define terms and to repeat themselves until the language moved from abstraction to action. I paid for parking, filed forms, and added new lines to my ledger: physical therapy, mobility aids, a ramp for the back steps, a cane. I recorded nights of broken sleep, mornings that began with coffee and a joke, and small acts of domesticity that resisted the notion that life is only bank statements. Both sets of notes mattered, the procedural and the tender. In my files they bore equal weight, one column for expenditures, another for the quotidian gestures that made up care. On the page, receipts and scribbles about bad jokes shared over tepid tea sat side by side. The ledger was not a cold instrument but a diary of fidelity, a record that acknowledged the economic reality of care without reducing human acts to transactions. 2013 to 2014, there was no miraculous reconciliation in those years. Habit, like gravity, persisted. My parents' retained reflexes formed over decades. Their habits did not yield merely because I had written a check. They could be sharp at unexpected moments, turning a casual remark into a wound. My mother's brittle humor sometimes contained admissions wrapped in defenses. "We raised you right," she would say, adding as if to temper gratitude, "You know how to fix things and to pay what needs paying." Her apologies were thin, often disguised as explanations. Those moments cut. The alternative, demanding apologies that might never come, would have been to relock myself into a ledger of resentment. I chose instead to keep paying, not to buy absolution but to preserve small daily dignities: warmth, shelter, avoidance of a shame that multiplies in quiet corners. The payments bought time and relief. They did not erase memory. They bought a different currency: the capacity to sit with complicated people without daily catastrophe. In a society that often mistakes emotional closure for moral advancement, I came to prefer practical tenderness. The work of keeping people warm and housed was not forgiveness, it was the only feasible kind of justice available. Spring 2014, the mechanical complications of managing a household with limited resources accumulated. When the mortgage company sent notice of a looming rate adjustment on my parents' small house, the possibility of refinancing loomed like public exposure. Refinancing would have required credit histories, assessments, and invasive explanations, turning private struggle into bureaucratic shame. We decided instead to cover the gap for a season, to stabilize payments and avoid the humiliation of foreclosure notices that can widen into community gossip. The funds came from modest rental income and from savings I kept for emergencies. I moved money between accounts like a careful bookkeeper of a small charity, balancing immediate needs against future hopes. Choosing that path required risk calculations and a readiness to accept that some personal savings would be used to avoid a public collapse that would most hurt the people I loved. June 2014. In June my father fell ill with what at first seemed a routine infection. Hospitals are places where the politics of care become porous and visible. Discharge planners talked in codes of liability, insurance representatives translated human need into alphanumeric shorthand. The clock of bureaucracy ticked in a language divorced from the rhythms of recovery. I sat with case managers who weighed liability against cost and decided whether in-home aids would be appropriate. I argued for in-home supports respectful of my parents' dignity and privacy, insisting that their habits of self-sufficiency would be better preserved by careful home management than by institutionalization. The case manager agreed to a short course of in-home nursing care. Medicaid forms were filed and processed. A local nonprofit, one my household had worked with in small community projects, provided a modest subsidy to cover part of the copayment. These arrangements were not grand, they were carefully stacked bricks that made room for decent living. They were bureaucratic work that required patience and advocacy. Telephone calls at odd hours, appeals to supervisors, the translation of human need into bureaucratic categories that could be funded. It was the slow, unglamorous work of building a life that could be sustained. 2015, the inevitability of wills and end-of-life accounting began to make itself felt in the quiet, bureaucratic way these things do, insistently and a little bit mundane. Their estate was small, unsurprising for a life lived in frugality and restraint. Conversations about inheritance turned, less to disputation about sums and more to logistics. Which papers would be found where, how property would be transferred without drama, and what small objects might be preserved as memory. My sister and I organized paperwork, photocopied documents, wrote instructions with the practical clarity I had come to prize. That year we thought of closure in the language of files and cupboards. There were human moments alongside the paperwork. My father laughed at an old joke and then looked at me with a softness from a different era. In that laugh and look there was both grief and a quiet, small satisfaction. The not glamorous work had been done. We had set accounts in order. We had made plans. The satisfaction was not moral superiority. It was the modest pleasure of seeing a life carried through with intelligence and attention until administrative and human needs aligned. 2016. My parents died within months of each other. They left behind an estate that was modest and tidy. The ledger I had kept proved useful, not as evidence to be brandished but as a record for quiet closure. I paid remaining bills from receipts filed in shoeboxes and spreadsheets, filed final forms, and helped my sister and me divide a few objects of memory. A teapot, a photograph of a summer whose light had seemed dormant until we saw it again in print. There were no last words to rewrite history. Instead there were the daily mechanics of loss, filings, maps of accounts, the careful distribution of things that had once seemed ordinary. The funerals were modest, attended by neighbors, old friends, and the people who had sat with us through nights of worry. 2016 to 2018. After the funerals I returned to public advocacy with a renewed focus and sharper pitch. Personal losses clarified the ways municipal systems both failed and could be adjusted. The small pilot program I had earlier shepherded through a local committee could not solve the systemic invisibility of caregiving alone, but it created a vocabulary for reimbursement, a way to show municipal officials that paying for in-home supports and small repairs could prevent much costlier outcomes. This was the kind of argument that fit the pragmatics of city budgets. Modest upfront investment in home repair and caregiver stipends could reduce emergency services and institutional costs later. I began to testify at hearings in municipal rooms with flimsy curtains and fluorescent lights, and later before more formal committees where suits and long microphones made my voice feel both compact and ceremonious. In those rooms I brought data from our own case, the prevented evictions, avoided hospital readmissions, the nights my father slept at home because a ramp had been installed. These concrete items proved persuasive where moral appeals alone sometimes faltered. Data tunes policymakers' ears because it translates compassion into operational possibility. The pilot demonstrated that small stipends for caregivers and emergency home repair funds could be leveraged to keep people in place, avoiding the social and fiscal costs of institutionalization. 2018. By 2018 my son, formed early by our kitchen table discussions, was working in housing assistance. He began to weave the lessons we had learned, the way a simple form could be made readable, the power of non-judgmental intake, into office practice. He saw how affordable housing, case management, and small family stipends could be aligned to keep elders at home. He proposed pairing housing case managers with caregiver stipends as a pilot, an idea later taken up in a neighboring city as part of a regional experiment. Change in municipal life is incremental and bureaucratic. It creeps forward like water wearing down stone until the shoreline of policy must be redrawn. 2019. The reforms we pushed for that year were not headline-grabbing. They were plain language forms, better signage at public offices, and a neighborhood volunteer pool for respite care trained to avoid judgment. We fought for an onboarding process that emphasized boundaries and confidentiality. We established a local emergency repair fund that could be accessed with minimal documentation so that a ramp or a heater repair could be funded quickly without putting an older person's dignity on trial at a clerk's window. These administrative fixes were designed to make everyday tenderness visible and reimbursable. 2020. The pandemic made visible what had long been hidden. Caregiving that had happened in the shadows behind closed doors was now a matter of public necessity. Municipal budgets were strained, but the argument for modest stipends and support for home modification became sharper than ever. The pilots we had begun demonstrated, under the harshest of lights, that early intervention saved money and protected lives. The metrics we had argued for, reduced hospital readmissions, caregiver retention, self-reported dignity, became suddenly more persuasive because they correlated with outcomes everyone feared. Policy that once seemed abstruse took on an immediacy otherwise absent. Through all those years, the hardest parts remained intimate and unresolved. My parents' earlier words, the times they called children a burden, surfaced like fossilized shells beneath newer sediments. They returned unannounced, a dismissive remark at a school event, a memory triggered by a lull in a meeting, the echo of a voice that had once said something sharp in a better-lit kitchen. For a moment, the ledger of resentment tipped my world as if all the checks and sheets bore a counterweight. Most often, however, the spreadsheet and the kitchen jokes existed together. I could see entries for tuition and rent beside notes about batter stains left in a mixing bowl and the laugh that followed an absurd cartoon. Accounting and affection, I discovered, had become two hands that held a pot steady, one measured, the other warmed. Neighbors and acquaintances read my actions in grand, often contradictory ways. Some found my quiet payments scandalous, as if supervising another adult's finances was a tacit claim to moral superiority. Others saw martyrdom. I resisted both labels. My payments were neither penance nor pilgrimage. They were pragmatic compassion translated into public forms. I converted private frustration into a style of public practice and taught my son, by example, not to perform sanctimony but to structure generosity. He learned, at the kitchen table and later in municipal offices, that generosity without structure is unsustainable and that rules without mercy become cruelty. When I prepared testimony for hearings, I would pull the spreadsheet and present its entries not as confessions but as case histories. Receipts are not merely proofs of expenditure, they are maps. They show where crises were averted and where investment delivered dignity. When policymakers understood that a ramp is a cost-effective alternative to institutionalization, they were more likely to fund ramps. When they saw that a modest caregiver stipend prevents emergency hospital stays, the stipend stops looking like charity and begins to look like prudent policy. It is a difficult lesson in political feasibility. Moral arguments become more potent when supplemented by numbers bureaucracies can understand. There were small episodes that revealed character with painful clarity. I remember my father methodically tying his shoelaces before a physical therapy appointment, steadying himself at the banister as if ritual gave structure to the day. I remember my mother's trembling hands telling a neurologist, despite her diagnosis, a long story about a neighbor's cat possessing more verve than either of us expected. These were ordinary moments, messy and human. They were neither clean moral fables nor neat tragedies. Habit and tenderness coexisted, reproach and care lived in the same sentence. They told me, every day, that we are not wholly villainous nor wholly compassionate. We are people trying to make sense of a history that shapes us. In the kitchen, one evening in 2017, my son and I compared entries in the ledger. He laughed at a column header I had once labeled, "Small Acts, Large Comforts." He pointed instead to the dignity column and said, simply, "That's the most important." He spoke of his proposals: better signage at public offices, forms written in plain language, a volunteer pool for respite care trained to respect boundaries. He had, at once, patience for the slow work of municipal change and impatience with its glacial pace. That combination made him effective. He insisted, as I had, on blending tenderness with administrative rigor. He understood that the civics of care had to be both compassionate and procedural. A friend once suggested my approach had made me soft. I did not accept soft as a compliment. The work required strategic tenderness, a firm kindness. It demanded margin and stamina, the willingness to make phone calls late at night, to sit with weary clerks and persistent case managers, to negotiate an installment plan that kept a house warm. It demanded the discipline of a spreadsheet and the warmth of a kitchen laugh. This pattern is not weakness, it is civic craft. It is the labor that holds community together because it meets people where they are rather than asking them to be what bureaucracy prefers. By 2021, the regional pilots had compiled enough cases to be instructive. Municipal leaders who had once been skeptical began to see that minor, steady investments in home-based care and caregiver stipends reduced emergency costs. Reports from the pilots were unflashy and sober: fewer readmissions, higher caregiver retention, improved neighborhood stability. These structural changes are the kind of thing the public rarely notices until they have accumulated enough to redraw a map. My son's work drafting program guidelines bore our kitchen's plain language. He insisted on clauses requiring non-judgmental intake and on evaluation metrics measuring both dollars saved and self-reported dignity. Those design details mattered because public programs live or die on a handful of careful decisions. There were times when the lack of emotional closure felt like a debt unpaid. I had hoped for apologies, soft admissions that would rewrite memory. Those words did not arrive in the forms that would have satisfied the child I once was. My father's mild praises never attained the full shape I had imagined. My mother's apologies were partial, defensively folded into explanations. I had to accept a different kind of justice, practical tenderness. Acts of care, administered carefully and publicly, became the justice available to me. The realization that moral closure is not always available reframed how I spent my life. I shifted from yearning for the past to building for the future. I was surprised by how many of my actions were both urgent and preferential. I had no interest in modeling martyrdom for my son. I wanted to show him that money, when carefully organized, buys space for dignity. I wanted him to understand that accountability, recorded in a ledger or durable directive, can be an expression of love. I taught him to treat receipts not as tokens of suffering but as tools of civic change. I wanted him to see that care blends administration and intimacy. Warmth without structure often fails, and structure without warmth is hollow. At the funeral, modest and populated by neighbors who had offered help without comment, my sister and I read what we could say honestly. We did not attempt to mend the past. We acknowledged the facts that could be acknowledged. We thanked those who had helped with forms, who had brought meals without comment, who had sat awake when we could not. Afterwards, we divided small things that held memory. We did not fight. We tried not to write a triumphalist story about how our actions redeemed all past wrongs. We accepted complexity. The people who raised us were neither simple villains to be condemned nor saints to be canonized. They were complicated figures, formed by their own histories, capable of both tenderness and cruelty. In the years after the funerals, I continued working in civic ways. I wrote policy memos, trained volunteers to be neutral navigators, and created guides for simple home modification funds. We established a small emergency assistance pool requiring minimal documentation so dignity could be preserved without invasive interrogation. We created volunteer onboarding processes that emphasized boundaries and respect. The work was a steady accumulation of many small edits to the public story. Changes that, in aggregate, made daily life slightly more navigable for people unable to navigate bureaucratic mazes. There is mercy, I have found, in ongoing practice. My parents' opinions of me never shifted in ways that fully satisfied my younger self. The apologies I once wanted were not delivered in tidy packages. Yet the world they left behind is, in small administrative ways, easier to navigate. A child once labeled a burden could, with careful hands and a steady pen, ensure the people who named them thus did not freeze in winter. That is a kind of mercy, not salutary forgiveness perhaps, but a practical correction to a public story. I have no desire to claim saintliness. The record I kept was practical and strategic. Receipts are maps as much as proofs. They helped me testify at hearings and helped committees see that caregiving saves dignity and reduces later, costlier interventions. A ramp is not sentimental, it is an economic alternative to institutional care. A modest stipend is not charity but preemptive fiscal planning. Administrative language matters because it makes moral intention actionable. It is the bridge between private care and public policy. There are details I keep because they reveal character. The precise way my father fumbled his shoelaces before therapy, my mother's hands telling improbable, long stories despite their tremors. Those details stay with me because they are not neat moral signposts, they are human. They show how habit and tenderness coexist, how reproach and care can live in the same sentence. We are not wholly villainous, nor wholly compassionate. We are people trying to make sense of the particular history that made us. If there is one concrete lesson I hope to pass on, it is this: care can be resistance and administration at once. We resist cruelty not only by grand gestures but by refusing to allow it to compound in our systems. We administer mercy by keeping receipts and making plans. To be kind does not mean to forego method. To be methodical does not require emotional austerity. When I think of small stipend checks that kept a neighbor in her home, or of ramps that prevented a move into an institution, I do not imagine triumphs that erase a past. I consider them corrections, edits in a public story that make the next generation less likely to be labeled an extra cost. There is a stubborn small beauty in the mundane. I have come to love the sound of a spreadsheet opening in the morning, the way rows fill with dates and muted verbs. I have come to appreciate the smell of coffee in the grey dawn minutes when there is time to read a form before a clinic opens. I have learned that dignity is sometimes bought in increments: a repaired heater, a paid tax bill, a ramp that keeps a neighbor at home. These acts are steady and unglamorous. They require attention to detail and an acceptance that the world will not thank you promptly, if at all. When I remind myself why I did what I did, the reasons remain modest and practical: to keep shame from piling on with illness, to give my son a model of pragmatic compassion, to make our systems less punitive and more humane. The list is not glamorous. It is compromised and purposeful. It recognizes that most human needs are both administrative and soulful. They require receipts and warm hands. I do not close the book on forgiveness because I do not yet know whether such closure is possible for everyone, or for me. I close, instead, certain accounts each month and open others. The printed paper file lives in a drawer near the toaster. A digital copy lives in the cloud. It is not an accusation. It is a record of practice. Whenever I pay a bill for someone who cannot, I enter it. Whenever I persuade a clerk to expedite a form, I log time and result. It keeps mercy from becoming mere sentiment. To anyone who wonders whether this small, continuing labor is worth it, yes. It is worth it in modest, real ways. The neighborhood pilot prevented a neighbor from moving into an institution she did not want. Ramps and stipends kept families together. The administrative language we introduced into municipal practice made it possible for caregivers to be reimbursed without undergoing invasive interrogations. None of this erases the sting of words once uttered. None of this rewrites all memory. But it builds more navigable futures. What I want for those who come after me is a world where apologies are not extracted at the cost of dignity and where kindness is not merely performative. I want an architecture where small acts of care are visible, documented, and supported. I want policy that recognizes what families already do in the shadows and brings those acts into the light with modest compensation and steady respect. I want a vocabulary that names the difference between being generous and being consumed. I want laughter and receipts at the same table, ink to protect joy, and joy to dignify the numbers. This is not a tidy victory. It was never a single curtain call. It is a continuing practice. If my parents' view of me never shifted in the ways I once wished, the world they left behind is a little less treacherous than the one they inherited. Maybe that is mercy enough. Maybe it is the quiet answer to the question asked decades ago: not a single word of forgiveness, but many small, deliberate acts that keep people warm and whole. If the first phase of our work felt like a slow accrual of receipts, each utility bill paid, each form filed, each ramp installed, then the second phase, beginning in earnest in 2022, felt like translating that accrual into statute and budget lines. The year that followed the regional pilots did not bring dramatic moral epiphanies from the people who raised me. It did bring a different kind of conversion, administrative language laid brick by brick into municipal practice. In January 2022 I began meeting, almost weekly, with a small coalition of city staff, community organizers, and 2 of the pilot program managers. Those meetings were practical in tone. We set calendars, identified data points, and agreed on a modest, rigorously defined goal: to move from pilot to permanent allocation in the municipal budget. The timing mattered. The memory of the pandemic's first years, 2020 and 2021, still shaped public imagination. Local emergency rooms had been shorn down to triage, and families who cared for loved ones at home had been stretched thin. Budget conversations in 2022 were framed by 2 realities. First, the fiscal prudence of preventing institutional care where safe home-based support could be provided. Second, a new appetite among officials for place-based solutions that could keep neighborhoods intact. In March 2022 we presented the pilot data to a joint committee of the Health and Housing departments. My son's drafts, language born at our kitchen table, were in the packet. He had insisted, against a dozen bureaucratic impulses, on 3 features: non-judgmental intake, a stipend formula tied to local cost of living and time spent, and rigorous metrics that measured both fiscal outcomes and self-reported dignity. On March 18, 2022, the committee convened. The room was small. The chairs were too close together. I remember the date because I had printed extra copies of a spreadsheet that showed 3 years of avoided expenditures, hospital readmissions reduced, delayed institutionalizations, fewer ambulance calls. The numbers were neither dramatic nor self-evident in isolation. They became persuasive in the context of stories. I read aloud for the committee the ledger entries I had kept. A heater repaired on November 12, 2018. A tax bill paid under duress on February 2, 2019. A caregiver stipend issued one Saturday in June 2020 so a nurse could be hired for an afternoon shift. I explained what each entry meant in real life. The heater repair kept someone from moving into a shelter during a deep freeze. The tax payment prevented the sudden destabilization of an elderly household. The stipend allowed a daughter to accept a job and keep her mother at home. By June 2022, the committee's skepticism had softened into a guarded curiosity. A local newspaper covered the story on June 21. Small stipends, big impact, the headline read. The piece was careful. It quoted an alderman who described the pilot as practical and surprisingly humane. That public attention mattered because municipal politics is a machine of narratives. Budgets are argued in plain sight. Constituents read the same articles their representatives do. My son's language, the clause requiring intake be non-judgmental, had a particular effect on volunteers who staffed intake centers. It turned a process otherwise starved of empathy into a moment where people's dignity was the primary variable. The ordinance that would institutionalize the pilot was introduced to the City Council on September 12, 2022. I remember the day because my hands were visibly shaky when I signed the petition to place it on the agenda. My sister, who had agreed to testify with me in quiet solidarity despite her own ambivalence toward our parents, practiced her remarks in a parking lot before we walked in. The hearing itself, October 3, 2022, ran long into the night. There were skeptics. Some argued city funds should not subsidize informal family caregiving, others feared fraud. We had prepared for that objection. We brought receipts, not as moral indictments but as audits of practice. We showed, in neat columns, how modest stipends and simple home modifications prevented larger expenses later. The council voted, narrowly, to adopt the ordinance and appropriate a pilot line in the coming fiscal year. Implementation followed the vote, and in January 2023 the program launched under a small interdepartmental office that my son accepted a job to run. He had been working as a policy analyst in another capacity. The shift felt, to him and to me, like the natural continuation of the sentences we had composed at our kitchen table. He took a modest salary and a bigger workload. His first task was training neutral navigators, a phrase he had fought to include in the ordinance. These navigators were not case managers in the heavy-handed sense nor charity workers in sentimental disguise. They were trained to ask practical questions, protect privacy, and expedite paperwork. Training took place on February 14, 2023, in a community center that smelled of coffee and recycled paper. We practiced intake scripts. We role-played moments of suspicion and moments of acute need. We rehearsed the dignity-preserving response to a trembling voice asking for help. The early months of 2023 were instructive in small ways. A neighbor I had known for 2 decades, Elena Alvarez, 72, a widow with blue hair and a stubborn garden, used the program to secure a modest stipend for weekly home cleaning and a ramp built that spring. The ramp was installed on May 19, 2023. The stipend checks began monthly in June. Elena did not write us a letter, but she did invite me and my sister to tea in July. She made no long moral pronouncements. What she offered instead was the quiet pleasure of being able to walk to her porch without fear and of keeping her herb pots where she liked them. Those small satisfactions became, for me, more persuasive than any apology I had imagined. Not all months were wins. By late summer 2023, a conservative coalition on the council threatened to reallocate the line item. They argued the program was an unnecessary expense during an inflationary period. We counted both receipts and votes and met with those councillors one by one. It was tedious and necessary work, showing the relationship between a $1,200 ramp and avoiding a $20,000 institutional relocation, explaining how a $300 monthly stipend could keep a neighbor in place and reduce later Medicaid expenditures. These were not the kinds of arguments that made front-page drama. but they mattered because they moved numbers and, eventually, votes. On September 28, 2023, the Council renewed the appropriation for the fiscal year. The margin was thin. We celebrated quietly. The program's record kept improving in ways that were both statistical and human. By March 2024, aggregate data presented at a regional convening showed a consistent pattern. Neighborhoods with sustained home-based supports had lower rates of institutional placement for older adults and fewer emergency department visits for conditions that could be stabilized at home. These patterns were not universal or instantaneous. They accrued over months and years. The County Health Department published a brief in May 2024 documenting pilot outcomes. It was not a manifesto of triumph, but a ledger of modest savings and testimonies of preserved dignity. The brief included 3 case studies, one of which was Elena Alvarez, described in plain terms with her permission and with safeguards for privacy. The visibility helped other municipalities take notice. As the program grew, so did the bureaucratic responsibilities. More forms had to be standardized, more navigators needed training, more stipends required oversight. The paradox was constant. Dignity required both paperwork and warmth. We increased our investment in training to prevent the intake process from feeling like interrogation. We created a 1-page dignity checklist for navigators to use during first visits. Explain confidentiality, offer translation, ask about immediate needs, and provide a printed copy of rights. The checklist was small but became, over time, a signature practice replicated in 3 neighboring cities by 2025. There were personal shifts, too. My sister and I found a slow ease in daily matters we had not expected. We coordinated calendars without dramatics. She took on volunteer recruitment. I continued with policy memos and committee briefs. We both visited Elena on holidays. The small hands that once reached for my baby became, in time, capable hands that tamped soil and signed letters of support for neighborhood grants. Our parents' memory never became a neat moral ledger. We still kept their larger failures in mind. But those failures were one part of the ledger and our subsequent acts another. National conversations began to shift. By late 2024, several state lawmakers took notice of the way municipal pilots had cobbled together public and private resources to keep people at home. On December 15, 2024, a state representative released a proposal to study caregiver stipends at a statewide level. The proposal was tentative and required appropriations. We offered testimony in January 2025, bringing our own spreadsheets and examples. My son wrote the testimony in a voice that was, to my ear, familiar, plain, careful, humane. We spoke of record-keeping practices that protected recipients from suspicion and of intake language that prevented humiliation. We also warned about unintended consequences, how rigid eligibility rules could exclude the very people the program sought to protect. Our testimony emphasized a principle that had become its own kind of moral law: policy should lower the threshold of dignity, not raise it. There were new battles as the timeline extended. By April 2025, a measure in the state legislature proposed strict audit provisions designed to prevent fraud. That measure would have created invasive reporting requirements likely to deter caregivers and recipients. We convened a working group and proposed alternative safeguards: randomized audits based on risk indicators rather than blanket documentation, a whistleblower mechanism for genuine fraud, an ombuds office to handle complaints. These proposals were technical, dry, and, in the end, effective. They preserved the program's integrity without turning dignity into a conditional commodity. Alongside policy work, I kept files in a drawer near the toaster. The physical printouts, the receipts, the forms, the letters confirming stipends, accumulated in a way that felt less like hoarding and more like archival work. That drawer contained, among other things, a copy of the ordinance, the training checklist, a list of names of volunteers who had worked with us since the pilot, and a small stack of thank you notes from neighbors. Occasionally I would pull out a sheet and remember the smell of winter when the heater was being repaired or the hand that had held mine quietly in the hospital corridor. These memories did not amend moral deficits. They sustained a narrative that connected ledger to love. By mid-2025, the program had not erased the embedded stigmas I had encountered in my childhood. My parents' repeated phrase, "a burden," had left traces in family scripts that did not vanish because of better policy. Old habits of speech persisted. At a family reunion in August 2025, someone used the phrase in a jocular way. My sister and I looked at each other and then at the speaker. We did not make a spectacle. We offered instead the practice of correction, a short remark that explained why that language was harmful and why it mattered to think otherwise. The moment was not an apology nor a theatrical renunciation. It was, in its small way, a pedagogy. It was the same subtle work we had done in intake rooms and at council meetings. Change not through excoriation but by making alternative habits easier. There were private tensions, too. My health was not perfect. In February 2025, I began to notice aches that would not fully dissipate. Medical visits required paperwork and patience. The irony was plain. The person who had kept so many receipts to protect others now found himself navigating his own forms more carefully. It deepened my empathy for those I had helped. It also clarified a truth I had suspected for years. Care infrastructure must be designed with the inevitability of reciprocity in mind. Everyone needs support at different times. Policy that treats caregiving as a one-way movement is fragile. Systems ascend when they account for the coming and going of needs. By late 2025, the state study had concluded that the municipal pilots offered measurable savings where programs prioritized low-barrier access and preserved recipients' dignity. In December 2025, a modest appropriation was included in the state budget to expand demonstration projects in 3 additional counties in 2026. It was not a sweeping reform, but it was institutional recognition of the principle we had been practicing. Small, steady administrative interventions could yield social and fiscal returns. The momentum was incremental and hard-earned. As 2026 began, I found myself preparing for a hearing in March at the state capitol. The session was scheduled for March 10, 2026, and it would gather municipal leaders, policy analysts, and representatives of state agencies. My son, now with 3 years of program leadership behind him, had asked me to present a short portion of our history. The early years, the ledger, the kitchen clauses. He wanted the story tied to the documents that had moved votes. I printed copies of key spreadsheets, redacted to protect privacy, and packed them in a folder that smelled faintly of the coffee and paper we had been living on for so long. Preparing testimony in 2026 feels, to me, like a continuation rather than a conclusion. These years have taught me that the language of receipts is not merely forensic. It is narrative. It tells a story about who we value and how we finance that valuation. It is one thing to want apologies on a pedestal, it is another to insist on practical tenderness at the kitchen table and in the municipal ledger. The former may be elusive, the latter is often achievable. The work I have done with neighbors, with city officials, and with my son is evidence that administrative design can channel moral intention into lasting infrastructure. It does not rewrite personal histories overnight, nor does it necessarily transform childhood labels into adult acceptance. But it does change the lives of living people, right now, in ways that reduce harm and increase opportunity. As I step into the hearing room in March, I will carry with me the physical copy of the ordinance, the check stubs from 2019 to 2025, and a small printed list of those volunteers who persist. I will speak in the voice that has gotten me this far, chronological, detail-oriented, and candid about limits. I will not ask the state for perfection. I will ask for the modest, structural practices that keep people safe and dignified in the everyday, non-judgmental intake, modest stipends, ramp funds, and navigators trained to keep forms from becoming barriers. I will urge them to remember that policy is not merely a ledger of costs and savings, but the scaffolding that allows ordinary human tenderness to take hold and endure. I will remind them that mercy often arrives late and in small denominations, and that our obligation is to make that mercy routine rather than exceptional. The hearing is not the end of a story, it is one more meeting in an ongoing project of turning private endurance into public capacity, and I will ask, with the plain evidence of my papers, that we keep building. The hearing on March 10, 2026, unfolded the way civic rituals often do, evenly scheduled, slightly overlong, punctuated by polite applause and the occasional cough. I arrived early and found my son behind the witness table already unfolding a neat stack of paper, the same carefulness that had produced our intake forms now applied to printed testimony. He wore a blue jacket he had borrowed from a colleague, and when he saw me he smiled in that private, slightly exasperated way that meant both reassurance and a reminder to stay concise. The room filled with municipal managers from counties that had run pilots, state analysts who had written the December 2025 appropriation language, and a handful of reporters who wanted a line that would fit a headline. I held my folder of receipts and the printed ordnance like talismans. We were allotted 20 minutes. My son spoke first in the morning panel, not as the son who had written testimony years earlier, but as the program director who had to account for caseloads, compliance, and outcomes. He narrated the ledger, intake numbers from the municipal pilots, the modest stipend totals, the number of navigators trained under the dignity checklist. He described the painstaking, human work of changing an intake conversation from interrogation to invitation. He spoke of Elena, carefully not by any identifying detail we had promised to redact, but as representative of a cluster of cases where home-based supports had kept people safe through a winter and out of institutional care through a fall. He quoted from the May 2024 brief and from the December 2025 budget language. He did not ask for romance. He asked for more pilots, more ramp funds, and a modest increase in the pool that could finance temporary home modifications. When it was my turn, I did something I had not planned on doing. I read a single paragraph from the intake checklist aloud. Explain confidentiality, offer translation, ask about immediate needs, provide a printed copy of rights, I said. Hearing the words in a room full of policymakers felt oddly transgressive. I then moved through a short chronology, the pilot in 2019 that had become a municipal ordinance, the replication across 3 neighboring cities by 2025, the May 2024 brief, the December 2025 appropriation, and I closed with the ledger and the drawer at home near the toaster. I spoke plainly about receipts as narrative evidence. The way a cancelled check is not only proof of payment but a story of attention, a record that someone else once held you safe. Questions followed that were familiar and new. One legislator wanted to know about fraud prevention. Another asked whether stipends would create perverse incentives. A state agency representative asked for an updated scorecard showing emergency department visits and rates of institutional placement. My son answered the technical questions. I answered the ones about language, demeanor, and the quiet labor of keeping dignity from dissolving in paperwork. At one point the representative who had introduced the December 15, 2024 study proposal leaned forward and said, "We need more of this, not less." It was not legislative commitment, but it was a phrase that carried weight. The hearing did not instantly change the budget baseline, but it did set a trajectory. Over the next 3 months the state office overseeing aging services issued guidance formalizing the randomized audit approach we had advocated in April 2025. In July 2026 the office published an implementation memo that described risk-based sampling rather than blanket, invasive reporting. It created channels for whistleblower reports and opened a small ombuds unit to handle appeals. These changes were not dramatic theater. They were procedural adjustments that, to my mind, reflected a grudging respect for the premise that dignity and accountability were not mutually exclusive. Municipal partners took notice. The pilots in the 3 counties named in the December 2025 appropriation ramped up their navigator trainings in August 2026, adding modules on trauma-informed intake and culturally specific translation services. By autumn 2026 local dashboards began to show incremental improvements. The counties reported fewer avoidable hospital readmissions among people enrolled in home-based supports and fewer emergency department trips for issues that could be handled with timely visits and a modest home modification. The narratives accompanying those numbers were important. A case manager in one county wrote a short note about an older man who, after a grab bar installation and 2 navigated home visits, reconnected with his granddaughter and stopped missing essential medications. The county's director shared the note in a regional convening in October 2026. When I heard it read aloud I recognized the architecture of the work, a small administrative practice yielding changes in everyday life. These gains invited new scrutiny. In November 2026, a fiscal caucus in the state assembly raised questions about scalability. They argued that pilot savings were context-specific and that the state's appropriation should be temporary. We responded with data and with testimony that emphasized the non-financial returns, reduced loneliness, preserved autonomy, the dignity of healing at home. We also recognized the counterargument. A program that could not demonstrate reproducible metrics would struggle in a budgetary environment that prized quantifiable returns. So we redoubled our efforts to standardize record-keeping in a way that respected privacy while still producing defensible metrics. We worked with university partners to create a de-identified performance dashboard that used lagged indicators to avoid exposing individual cases. The dashboard went live in February 2027 and became another small, bureaucratic artifact of the project's life. My personal life continued to thread through the public one. The aches that began in February 2025 persisted and, by late 2026, had become a set of diagnoses. In November 2026, I was diagnosed with a chronic inflammatory condition that required regular medication and periodic treatments. The irony of navigating my own forms, the same ones I had helped design for others, was sharp. The program that had been a policy object became a source of personal aid. A navigator from one of the demonstration counties helped arrange a home-based follow-up visit after a treatment when I had trouble driving. It was a small kindness, bureaucratically ordinary, that carried a quiet moral weight. My son, who had moved from program director to regional coordinator by early 2027, balanced these administrative responsibilities with family care. He sometimes late-night spreadsheets and sometimes brought home the stubborn, bright humor of his 10-year-old, who had, for the record, grown more adept at repotting soil. Family dynamics did not simplify. Language and stigma are not policy levers, they are habits. At a small Thanksgiving gathering in November 2026, someone used the phrase, "a burden," as a half-joke once more. My sister and I exchanged a steady glance and then, gently, explained why the phrase landed as it did. The convocation of correction had become our practice, not shaming, but substituting language that described concrete needs and supports rather than moralized worth. The moment did not resolve the accumulated histories, but it advanced a different family grammar. In June 2027, my sister organized a small workshop for volunteers that focused on those conversational practices: how to ask, "What do you need right now?" instead of "How much help do you need?" The workshop grew into a module in the Navigator training curriculum. Elena remained a presence in the margins of my life. We visited her in December 2026 during a cold snap when a heat pump failed in her building. Volunteers from the municipal program helped contact the landlord and arranged a temporary space in a community center. Elena's hands were slower than they had been in 2019, but steadier than I had feared. She planted a small row of herbs that summer of 2027 and wrote a short letter about how the stipend had allowed her to buy better seeds. We kept her letter in the drawer near the toaster alongside a thank you note from a volunteer and a photocopy of the ordinance. Those artifacts continued to be our public proof and our private consolation. In 2027, the state scaled its demonstrations into a formal 3-year evaluation funded under the appropriation that had been set in December 2025. The evaluation was not merely a sums and save exercise. It investigated how different configurations of navigators, stipend amounts, and ramp funds influenced outcomes across urban, suburban, and rural contexts. The study design, published in March 2027, included qualitative interviews with participants and care partners in addition to administrative data. This integrated approach answered one recurring critique: that metrics alone cannot capture dignity. The interim report, released in September 2027, emphasized variation. Some counties showed faster decreases in emergency visits where navigators were embedded in primary care clinics, others saw better housing outcomes where stipends were slightly higher. The report's modest conclusion echoed our earlier lessons: there is no single technical panacea, attentive design matters. Political winds shifted again in late 2027. An election cycle brought new legislators with different priorities. Some proposed expanding the program beyond pilots into a statewide benefit. Others suggested redirecting funds to broader health initiatives. We lobbied, testified, and refined our pitch. I found that my messages had to be shorter and more audacious in some settings. A 20-second soundbite about dignity would not carry the nuance of a hearing but could galvanize support on a radio segment. We learned to tell both kinds of stories: the long paper trail and the brief anecdote that could pass through a morning commute. During this period, the program's procedural pieces matured in ways that surprised me. An accreditation process for navigators was piloted in February 2028, developed collaboratively by municipal partners and a community college. The accreditation emphasized not only data entry and eligibility rules but also courses on cultural humility and language use, Exactly the things my sister and I had come to value. By spring 2028, 3 neighboring counties were participating in the accreditation program, and a small philanthropic foundation offered grant funding to support navigators' continuing education. These were neither revolutionary nor final solutions, but they constituted a scaffolding, training that translated values into practice. The fiscal story remained complicated. Savings accrued in some areas but not others. The State Comptroller's Office, in a report released in May 2028, concluded that targeted investments in home supports could reduce institutional placement rates over a multi-year horizon if combined with upstream housing and transportation investments.